This is a story about the stories we tell ourselves, the stories we live out in the world, and the space between those two. It's about how we love, how we lose, and how we recover, or not, through the stories we make up in our heads. I'm Robin Rice, and this is also my story. Preface to Chapter 10. This chapter, as with every other, tells my truth, though I have changed the names of many of those who are still alive. Now, though, I'm about to lie to you. It's not for my own sake, but that of other living souls whose stories I don't have permission to share. As a fiction writer, I'll shape the story details. As a truth teller, I assure you that all the meaning, the essence of the essence, is exactly how it was. I'll be as honest with you as I can be with myself. It felt only fair to mention that up front, especially in this chapter, which is filled with layer upon layer of lies. Chapter 10. Choices. Do you believe in choices? It's a big question. Of course, there's the illusion of choice. Will it be a red or gold or blue phone cover on an Apple or an Android? Dinner in or out? But what about the more important choices? As a writer of fiction, my choices start at the blank page, and the options for setting, characters, names, personalities, plots, pivots, forks in the road, and red herrings are endless. Each word is a choice. Each word is a choice. But in life, so much of our story is determined before we are consciously aware that there are choices to be made. Our parents' ways and our grandparents before them, the early influence of siblings and neighbors and teachers and political figures, our education, financial stability, the land we inhabit, city or country, ocean or trees. So much of it already determined. It is as if we ourselves are mere characters in a book. There is also our biology, our chemistry, our genetics, drivers that our surface identity tends to hugely underestimate. So much pushes and pulls us from beneath our awareness. As an example, these days I see how biology is pushing young girls and boys to procreate a good 20 years or more before they think they want to. The mind says, wait until your late 30s at least, focus on your career, and you have time. The body, though, screams, you're 13, go forth and procreate now. What an undertow of confusion, a steady drone of conflict requiring internal navigation. It's not just mating either, but all that comes with. It's in the urge to be popular, to be picked, to be attractive, to be smart. At the same time, a young person knows they must stop, thinking wisely of their future, to make good choices not of hips, teeth, and height, but of compatibility, education, and family wealth. This is the urge towards society and social safety. With all that, I must ask again, do you believe in choice? I often ask those who work with me to imagine a frigid, snow-capped mountain. You are bitterly cold, I say, fingers freezing near to frostbite, the wind howling. You are caught in a storm, unprepared, lost, and really, really scared. You wonder why on earth you have gotten yourself into this mess. Now imagine another frigid, snow-capped mountain. Here you are also bitterly cold, fingers freezing to near frostbite, the wind howling. You also wonder why on earth you have chosen to go mountain climbing, but you laugh at the thought. Internally, you are exhilarated, deeply engaged, and focused on your goal. These two scenarios externally offer the same conditions. It's the internal choice, or no choice, that makes the difference. Did you choose to go mountain climbing? This also illuminates the writer's truth that in every story, you have only two choices to keep a reader reading. You must either solve a problem or create an adventure. Without one or the other, the reader simply will not turn the page. But it's not only in writing. In our lives, it's much the same. Without an adventure, we have nothing to do, nowhere to go, and as a result, no real reason to get out of bed. Knowing this, our brain manufactures a problem to solve. Even when things are just fine. Even when we say we intend peace and balance or joy. Even when on vacation. But get into an adventure and all that problem solving is put to good use. We find our way with energy to spare. Perhaps the exact same amount of challenge will be baked into both, but in one our spirit flies, in the other it tanks. This is the one choice I fully believe in. It's not the booby prize of attitude, but the deepest core of ourselves that, with some effort, we have access to. Did you choose this life story, these characters, and the plot with all its twists? Or is this life for you random? You but a flea on the tail of a dog that is your world? And what about the deeper, more meaningful aspects of you? I call it soul, but feel free to name it as you will, because who can know what it really is? Does the soul have a choice in things? Perhaps some greater or even supreme choice? Was it maybe the soul of us that made all those story choices in the first place? Did we choose, for example, the important people who would enter our life? Maybe before we were even born? Were those choice points clear? Were there options and inevitabilities both? Or maybe only likelihoods and leanings? And what of karma? The idea that we get what we got because of what we did before, and we'll get what we get next based on what we do now. In its truest form, that detailed in the ancient Hindu philosophies, it's far more complex than our Mick karma ideas of today. But given it's made our way into our cultural psyches and imaginations, how you doing, karmically speaking? To answer, truly answer, such questions is not a joke. It is how we come to be in touch with the depths of our oceanic life, our truest truths. It is how we know thyself, as prescribed at the Temple of Apollo. It is to find our own origin story, be it truly true or only something along the way of that. Unfortunately, this quest for ourselves is usually barely begun in our young adult years, right when we could use it the most. Enter the labyrinth. I met Frank between my father's death at 18 and Ricky's at 22. Death's now how I marked eras in my young life. I was anything but free from my father, but with his death, I was under the illusion that I had escaped his influence. I would be my own kind of wilder, while also kinder, explorer now. And so, on a night that seemed like any other, I was at a nightclub in Washington, D.C. It was not the kind of place I normally frequented. So much so, I can't remember why I would have been there or who I went with. Some girlfriend, I'm sure, as I would surely not have gone alone. I was wearing my most provocative black jumpsuit. No bra, cut nearly to the belly. Biology had me on the hunt. Or was it karma or destiny behind this one? I stood next to a good-looking guy who looked a few years older than me. We were at the edge of a balcony overlooking the dance floor, where we stood without speaking for some time. Finally, I surprised myself by turning and saying, "Don't you ever talk to a girl?" He turned to me, bluntly said, "No," and walked away. I remember shrugging it off without much thought. But 5 minutes later, he returned. I'm told his brother, who was with him, had given him a good talking to. "I'm sorry, it's been a bad week. I'm Frank." Attractive enough to be instantly forgiven, I replied with a simple, "I'm Robin." I wasn't expecting a boyfriend. One-night stands were all one could expect from a relationship that started at a bar, right? But after the one night, he called asking for another date, and then another, and Well, something started. I had no way to know Frank would turn into a committed relationship, my first experience of living with a man, and eventually a beautiful engagement ring compliments of his mother. I for sure did not foresee an unexpected pregnancy and abortion. I had no way to know that despite all we went through, and though he was the first solid love in my life, we would still break up. As it was all unfolding, normal as any young love, something in me dropped into place. Something settled. Something was made whole. I had never been in this territory before. Being chosen, being with someone, after a lifetime of feeling alone. Only those with a history like mine can understand how fortunate, how blessed that feels. Frank was not just any guy either. He was intelligent, beautiful, with bright blue eyes, and already more successful than most I knew our age. A first-generation European-American scientist. He was a better catch than I might have imagined myself landing. Catch? Landing? You see where my biology-bobbing head was at? I was warmly invited into his family, and I fell in love with his parents and younger brother. It was as if they were my own family, because for a while they were. Normal. That's how it felt. Normal for once. Normal, a kind of gift. Everything on my list was ticked. Good genes, nice personality, solid family. Then add good in bed, bonus check. Seemed to love me, big check. Frank was everything I was hoping for and all I needed to hope for. Finally, my own Henry. Mine, all mine. Someone to go out with on Friday night. Go grocery shopping with on Saturday morning. And sleep in with on Sundays. On Mondays, he went back to work and I to graduate school. It was all so normal. There's that word again. Besides that, we had a real friendship. I liked him. He liked me. So nice. I should have been over the moon. I told myself I was. Well, there was the fact that he was an atheist, but I could work with that. I'd made my God exit with caveat by the time of Frank, and was not yet at my post-Ricky hell no. If my Christian friends didn't like the fact that he wasn't of our ilk, well, fuck them. You don't turn down tangible, touchable love, I explained to a girl from my old church. Not after my life story, you don't. Some friends respected that. Some shook their heads and fingers and exited my life. Fine with me. Even so, something wasn't exactly right with Frank. I could not identify it, only feel it, rather, feel an absence of it. Something I didn't just know that I thought I should. Was this love? Really? How are you supposed to be able to tell? Later in life, I would learn the right question to ask in such situations is, what do I know that I don't want to know? Over the years, this question would save me again and again when I was willing to listen to the answer I had for myself. But at the time of Frank, all I knew to ask were questions like, how do you know if it's a lifetime love? And how are you supposed to feel with your Henry, especially once you get settled in? People said marriage was hard. Why? How was it hard? Why did some last and others not? Questions like, isn't stability good, seemed to be not good enough to some part of me. But how could I think of turning away from a real, tangible man to love, who loved me? It was far more than a bird in the hand beating two in the bush. It was a bird in the hand versus not even a bush. The door I had longed for and begged for and searched for, it had finally opened. Why wouldn't I step through? It would take another man to change my life trajectory and narrowly avoid what, in hindsight, would have been the wrong choice for me and for Frank. When that new man arrived, I understood what I had only intuited before. If you have to ask if it's a lifetime love, it probably isn't. When I returned Frank's mother's engagement ring, closing that door and breaking the whole family's heart, I told myself I was losing my mind. At least, I was losing my one and only safe path. But the truth was this: I wasn't enough in love with Frank. He was a beautiful person and a lovely man, but there was a but. He wasn't my destiny after all. Side note, in that magical way of writers, I was contacted by Frank for the first time in more than 3 decades, about a month after writing this chapter's first draft. We met on Zoom a few weeks later, with his wife's blessing. He'd been married for more than 30 years, with 2 grown daughters. He looked very different to me, but I'd have known his voice anywhere. We agreed we had no regrets, though the ending was rough, and even though the love we had for each other was real. It was lovely to catch up, and to hear how things are for him now. Anyway, as the saying goes, that was when the plot thickened. If anything was or has ever been destiny to me, this was it. I was walking down the streets of New York City, a book contract in my hand, having just met with my new editor at Harper & Row Publishers, back when they were Harper & Row Publishers. How it happened that I had created, built, and sold my first business, and was about to be a published author, before I had even graduated from college, was a wonder to me. I recall filling out the paperwork for my book jacket in my tiny Georgetown English basement apartment. Not the same one I was in with Tim, but not far away. The form I had printed out had 1,000 questions to fill in, most asking for details about my education, work history, and previously published books. The open space below the questions, with a great deal of room to answer in full, went empty. I returned the blank sheets to my editor with apologies, saying, "I'm sorry, I'm not really a writer." To which she replied, "Harper & Row Publishers is about to publish a book you wrote. You are a writer." I was giddy with the reality that I had actually somehow, almost without noticing, started to make something of myself. I had only one more thing to do before hopping a train back to Washington, D.C. It was to meet a connection I'd been given, a man at a company in need of some freelance copywriting work. Planning a graduate degree in journalism, the book would earn me an admission that my graduate entrance exams did not warrant. And no longer having a business to run, I was happy for the added experience. Close enough from my publishers to walk, I found my way down one back alley and then another, then another. It was a typical New York summer. Hot, muggy, dirty, and charged with the energy of countless people on the move. The air was thick as the exhausts of small restaurants pumped out fumes, the classic smell of cheap oil boiling inexpensive food. The man's office was nicer than I expected. Clean, orderly, and populated with smartly dressed people of all ages. At least I'm not going to get abducted, I thought. I was wrong, kind of. Turns out that stunningly beautiful older men, the ones who are philosophical, accomplished, and genuinely kind, are the sort you have to look out for on the back streets of New York City. We met in his office, which was awash with books, music albums, and a massive amount of scribbled quotes hanging on walls that were covered floor to ceiling with write-on wipe-off boards. I recall the quotes were touching to me. Remarkably deep and insightful, there was not a cliché in sight. It made me think I was about to meet something more than an ordinary man. Also, I'd never read the majority of these particular quotes before, most from people I'd never heard of. The new words opened a new world. What had I been missing out on? The man briefly went through my writing samples, though I'd sent them on before our meeting and assumed that was what got me the interview. He asked me a few questions and said he liked what he saw. I had the job if I wanted it, and I did, as much for the intriguing boss as the work. He'd give me assignments, I'd do the research and writing, he'd review, and we'd talk, then rinse and repeat however many times as needed. He warned me that I was green, that my spelling was atrocious, but he could work with good ideas, which I had. I said I'd be working from D.C., but was just a train ride away when I was needed in person. He smiled appreciatively. On my way out, he asked me what brought me to New York. I told him about the book contract. Imagining his doubt at my early success, I shoved it toward him as proof. He looked at it with a growing, God-amazing smile. Immediately, his tone changed. You have to celebrate. He gave me the name of a bar where he said some of his favorite writers tended to go, and said he'd be there after 8 that night. If I came, he'd buy me a drink. Others would be happy for me, he said, and I deserved that. I was touched. All that would have been fine, good, nothing special. But when he handed me back the contract, our fingers touched. Cliché, I know, and he would hate that. It's impossible to say what actually happened, though. Never before or since have I felt such a jolt, save maybe the time my grandfather tricked me into touching the electric fence that kept the cattle on the farm fields. I looked down and away, having no excuse for how I jumped and no idea if he felt it too. When I dared look up, his smile had changed to a look more like curiosity. In that instant, I knew I'd give him anything he asked, maybe for the rest of my life. And if I was lucky, it would be a whole lot more than good copy. Up to this point in my life, I thought I understood people. I thought I was street smart and savvy about them. In specific, I thought there were only a handful of human types, and they all played their roles pretty much to script. In truth, this was only a matter of my having been exposed to such a small sampling of the world's people, cultures, and diversity of thinking. Another world was opening, even bigger than the one opened by all those beautiful words on the wall. I was hungry for it. Ravenous. And so, at that time and ever since, Andrew surprised me. Often. I spent many more hours trying to figure him out than I did writing. The latter was easy. I wasn't writing for a man like him. I was writing for his intended and much more superficial audience. Still, I wanted to please him. At the bar, of course I went, having no one back in D.C. to celebrate my book contract with. He was animated, clearly knew everyone, and seemed to care for them like an extended family. It was like the bar in the TV show Cheers, only real. He introduced me to fellow writers and told everyone we were celebrating my first book contract. Harper and Row, he added, eyebrows lifted and head cocked. With this, I was in, welcomed with both glasses raised and immediate advice and stories of publishing horrors. I silently prayed no one would ask me what this book was about, The American Nanny. Hardly something this crowd would want to read. They didn't ask. As it turns out, it was a pretty narcissistic crowd. There were more musicians than writers, several visual artists, and more than a few who seemed to show up only to drink. It wasn't as romantic as Paris in the early 20s, but God, it was epically romantic to the girl I was in my early 20s. Andrew and I didn't make love that night, or even the next time I was in New York, but somehow by the third trip, it was all arranged in advance. A hotel, a key, and separate times to enter and exit. It was pretty clear he'd done this before, but he assured me only once. Hard to believe at the time, but I since came to know him well enough to know it was true. He also made it clear to me that he was married with children. Whatever happened between us, he insisted, that would never change. He was a man of God, he said, as if there were no contradictions in what we were about to do. I believed him, but didn't care. Fuck God, and yes, let's fuck this man. He was a perfect specimen. 20 years my senior, but in far better shape than I was or ever would be in. He looked at me like he understood me, and us, and everything, even though he adamantly claimed he didn't. All he knew was that he wanted to devour me, and all I knew was that was just fine with me. Suck the marrow from my bones, should it please you, my love. I'm sure all this sounds ordinary. The younger woman, the older married man, both using each other for their own reasons. Younger woman makes older man feel alive, father complex, all that. And it could have been only that. If it had, though, I would have tossed it into the pile of all the other men I slept with and forgot. But if you've ever been to where real love, despite the odds, takes you, to that golden vein of what is true, you must understand that's what I'm talking about. And if you haven't, I can't say how sorry I am for you. It's chemistry. It's the interweaving of subconscious needs. It's risk, it's power, it's temporary, it's impossible. And yet it simply is, but in a way that is more is than is usually is. It seems the mind and biology and our souls and the very powers that run the universe must all be in on it. It was all there in the first electric shock, and it played out in the hot, sticky, chaotic hotel rooms of New York City. The most unexpected door of fate, or whatever you want to call it, had opened, and I had stepped through. Willingly, eagerly, desperately. Our bodies became temples to each other's prayers and needs and most base of desires. Andrew tells me now, nearly 40 years later, that when we met, he was on the verge of giving up hope of ever finding someone who understood pain and death and suffering. Someone also conflicted and battling with life at the core levels. Someone who is willing to dig and scrape for the right words to explain the unexplainable and speak the unspeakable. Someone who, as he often put it, was after God's own heart, even though I was adamant I wasn't. You must be, he said. That's all I can make of you. I was from the divine, real and true, he would insist, shaking his head in disbelief, even as I was standing in front of him naked. I brought his psyche back to life, he said, as if its death had been remarkably close. And for me, he opened something so new, so marvelous, I could barely think of it without silent tears falling. It killed me 1,000 times over that I would never be chosen by him, never have his ring or name, none of the fantasy. I would share no holidays nor be claimed by him, except in the tucked-away heat of day and seedy dark of night. Still, I saw it as a fair deal. This was just so much. Even if I could not have him, I had known what love was. It was all I'd ever wanted to know for real. And now I did. Together, we went to hidden galleries, tucked-away parties, and ultra-secret clubs. He knew up-and-coming comedians and seasoned actors. No one questioned why I was with him. Some things are unspoken and respected, I guess, even when a respectable man is behaving otherwise. No one said anything to the effect of, "Who's she?" or "Aren't you a family man?" Though given his place in the world, I'm sure they wondered. There was no trickery, even with them. It was what it was, and that was all it needed to be, and all that needed to be acknowledged. He was as elegant as he was discreet. The respect his friends gave him only made me admire him more. He was shy at first and for a long time to say what "we" meant to him. Eventually he admitted that he loved me, but only in written notes, adding that he did not understand why. He marveled at simple things, like that my fingers were so small and soft. He called me an angel and the one from God, bewildered at the religious connections, yet feeling his truth was, inexplicably, without hypocrisy. "It's all I can know, sweet sparrow," he said, gently touching me with those gigantic hands. We made a desperate kind of love. The quality movies get it right. It was clinging, aching, arching, longing. It shattered us for hours after. We would go to dinner weak in the knees and stare at each other, then burst into laughter, amazed that this moment could possibly exist. It was all that sex could be, but also a union of some higher order. We both knew it, and knowing that we knew it together, it was all the sweeter and more profound. For a short era, one epoch of time, we walked through this brutally honest yet dishonest passage of life. We were together yet apart, marveling at it separately and as one. understanding its limits and limitless nature. We took our time together anywhere, any way we could, sometimes traveling, but most often in yet another different New York City hotel. 6D, 209, the Roberts Room. The thrill of hearing where to meet is one I cannot manufacture for anything anymore. But I remember it. Whenever we parted, we became sober to the reality that we were always at risk of that meeting being the last one. He would tell me to be sure to take good care of myself, as if saying goodbye, just in case. I never answered. I always left second, allowing time after we parted to cry, ideally for hours. The agony was part of it. It just was. And then, suddenly, the final time became the final time. He was found out. Damn his writing notes and leaving one to be found in the most obvious of places, his desk. We were instantly over. His wife demanded I go, lest she leave and take his beloved children with her. This news shattering took us, or at least me, to a lower place than I could have imagined, even having planned for it someday. He sent one final note and said he would hang up the phone if he discovered it was me. I didn't even try to call, at least not for a very long time. It would be years before we spoke again. I let the hot salt of my tears go on for endless days. I was alone, alone, ripped apart. There would be no taking care of myself, no matter what he had said. It wasn't possible. Not anymore. I ask you, what is worse? When love is not real, or when it is, but you cannot have it, will never have it? When the inner mechanisms that keeps your breathing going go silent and still, so that you feel you must make a conscious effort. As expected, as promised, he chose to preserve what he had to, which I could only agree with. I saw it all too clearly. For him to be the man I knew and needed him to be, he had to choose his family, especially his children. He had to put them first. It's exactly what my father did not do for me. For Andrew to leave them in favor of me would be to destroy what made him who he was. And for him to lose who he was would destroy me. It was love's required sacrifice. There was no other option, no way out. A perfect impossibility. I felt certain that it was the formidable one within me who had said yes to him. She wanted me to know what I truly ached for in this life. But then, when it was time, she also helped me stay away. I buried the city, and all cities, deep in my heart. I left it for occasional indulgences of memory only. I would forever think of this as my great education, the time in my life when I was free to love who I really loved, and to be loved in return. After the shock wore off, I was dumbfounded to be on my own again. Frank was long gone, and I was glad for him to be. He deserved better than me. Anyone did. I thought again and again about the possibility that I might have been the cause of Andrew's not being able to raise his children. And in that way, I realized I was no better than my father. Left to my own wishes and dreams, I might have destroyed him and his children's lives, much as my father destroyed so much of mine. I could see only one path forward. I would return to church and commit to being a better person, even if I would not actually believe in the goodness of the God professed there. I would stop fighting the establishment and become it. I would find a man to marry and raise my children to be fine, upstanding members of society. God had won again, and I had lost again, much as anyone might expect. I put the formidable one away and opted to play the game. It sounds crass and harsh and wrong, but after that kind of love, it doesn't really matter who you marry and have children with, who you convince yourself is a good catch, who you tell yourself you're in love with. It doesn't matter that he's not fully in love with you either, so long as it all works out on paper. So long as you are safe and others safe from you. The strange agreement of destiny that would become my first marriage happened in a condo in Arlington, Virginia. The young adult group at the National Presbyterian Church was having a chili cook-off. There was a guy I'd inadvertently stood up 3 times who was attempting to talk with me. Possibly flirting, but I couldn't be sure. Sam, a lawyer, wasn't naturally the flirting type, so I thought it could have just been me. We sat down on the couch in one world, one where we were 2 singles having a conversation, and stood up 3 hours later as a couple. It was a time warp, I swear, a wormhole we traveled through, letting our future take its own course. I watched it happen even as I was the one it was happening to. Others saw it happening too, and I saw them seeing us, another out-of-body experience. Despite the attempted intervention from a wise older woman who one day pulled me aside to say, "Don't marry him," I did. I can do this, I thought. Marry in the church, have kids and cars, stop hurting people. I should, I insisted to myself. I must. And so it was that I married a man who I believed I loved and who believed he loved me. We had those 2 children and soon enough those 2 cars, one a minivan. Somehow I found myself living an emotionally subsistence life of surface identity as a wife and a mother in the suburbs. I adored my children, and they adored me, and that was enough. No Frank, no Andrew, just Sam. Who chose? What within me influenced the choosing? Biology, soul, karma, fear, regret? Do we have real choices? I asked myself then, as I do here now. I was not at all sure. I only knew it didn't matter anymore. Enter your labyrinth at BeWhoYouAre.com.